Welcome to our Tuesday, April 14th live stream. BP oil spill survivors tell their stories, connecting the dots between exposure and harm. I am your host, Dr. Riki Ott, the founder and director of the ALERT Project and a survivor of the Exxon Valdez oil disaster. ALERT is hosting a series of live streams on Tuesdays between March 24th to April 21st. To mark the memorials of our nation's largest oil disasters and to expose and deal with what I call unfinished business from these disasters. Today, once again, we are on a virtual tour in the Gulf of Mexico coastal communities. And joining us is Dr. Stephanie McCarter. Next up in the slot across the top, and Lesley Pacey. So I'll introduce them a little bit more in a minute. I just want to say that if there are any questions during this live stream, please use your chat box to relay them, and we will address what we can, given the time. I just like to tie these live streams into our campaign. What's the plan, EPA? Our national contingency plan for oil spills is horribly outdated, 26 years old. It's unsafe and it endangers lives, as witnesses have attested in these live streams. So ALERT is calling for national solidarity with oil spill survivors to demand accountability and system change. Our campaign, What's the Plan, EPA, and fundraiser are geared to better protect and inform and prepare citizens and communities and tribes for the next oil chemical disaster, to hopefully minimize some of these horrific sufferings that we've been hearing about. These are preventable. I'll talk a little bit more about our campaign and fundraiser after our panel. So today in episode 3, we are joined by Lesley Pacey, who will be next in the flow. She was a former Mobile Register reporter who founded and directs the Eastern Shore Community Health Partners. This is a nonprofit that maintains a word-of-mouth database on rare cancers and neurological disasters. Unfortunately, Julie Brady, who co-founded Costumes for a Cause, and also offers financial assistance for people in need of it who are suffering and battling cancer. She was unable to join us because of a last-minute family emergency. So Lesley, however, will be able to discuss and anecdotally and share her data set, which Julie provided to both of us. And finally, Dr. Stephanie McCarter is a medical doctor, internal medicine and environmental medicine, who currently practices at the Environmental Health Center of Dallas. Her predecessor successfully treated Exxon Valdez oil spill workers, which is what led me to this clinic 30 some years ago. So she will explain some treatment methods used for treating oil chemical symptoms and exposures and illnesses, along with things that you can do in your own home to reduce your toxic chemical exposures. So that said, we are going to jump into the first slide here, which is our usual map to show where we are on virtual tour. And we are going to be between Louisiana and Florida today, focusing on the Mississippi coast with Julie Brady's data, the Eastern Shore communities, that's the east side of Mobile Bay, with Lesley's data set. And we're going to briefly revisit Coden, Alabama on the west side of Mobile Bay to wrap up some unfinished business from episode 2. Last week in episode 2, next slide, please, Lori Bossard shared her story of being directly sprayed with Corexit dispersants in late August of 2010. Lori was out photo documenting the continued use of dispersants well after officials claimed that the use had stopped. She described the chemical burns that she pretty much experienced all over her body. But I didn't have the photos until just now. So I promised I would show them and share them. Over the years of dealing with this, she developed neurological, skin, and immune function disorders and illnesses and problems. Her initial doctors, next slide please, did not treat her for chemical illnesses or exposures. What she's finding now, she did finally find a doctor who would help her with detox and did, and also helped her rebuild her immune system function. However, as you can see, she still suffers from these horrible skin rashes that are now seemingly triggered by normal life stressors that her body could handle before being exposed to Corexit, before the BP disaster. Lori's full story is told in episode 2, which is posted on the Alert YouTube channel. For this episode, we start with the next slide, which is how do we get from exposure to intake, getting these chemicals into our bodies, to harm, like cancer. And there's sort of these 3 big steps. First, there has to be dangerous chemicals, and those dangerous chemicals have to be at dangerous levels. That's the exposure portion. And during the BP disaster, as we discussed in our first 2 episodes, we know that from April to at least October, studies found dangerous levels of dangerous chemicals in the air and the water from May through September of 2010 in the coastal communities and well inland of them. So that's sort of the first part. Then a person has to be exposed to those chemicals. And the intake is 4 ways: through inhalation, skin contact, which were the primary routes during the BP disaster. And also you can eat it, ingest it in your food, or contaminated food, eating contaminated food, and through drinking it in contaminated water. So if there's intake, there's going to be symptoms. Your body is going to say things like what we saw across the 4 states during the BP disaster: cough and cold and flu-like symptoms, eye and nose irritation, sore throat, headache, dizziness, skin rashes, and lesions. These are all your body saying that it's in harm's way somehow. Something that you're breathing or getting on your skin is causing an immune system reaction. So basically, these symptoms that I just mentioned that I witnessed personally, because I was in the Gulf, that everybody seemed to be having across 4 states, pointed to me that we were having a problem with something in the air. If it's this big and this fast and this many people across this wide of an area. So I suggested people get blood tests to look for oil solvents in their blood. And these tests came back. The ones that I saw were well over the upper 95th percentile of on the national scale, people who take these blood solvent tests, indicating that, to me, that there was dangerous chemicals and dangerous levels, and people were getting them into their bodies. So from exposure to intake. Now, is everybody going to get cancer or some kind of harm? Well, no, not everybody. But what very likely happens next, especially the third thing that happens, is a lot across the Gulf Coast, nobody really diagnosed for chemical exposures, chemical illnesses, and did a proper detox in 2010 when it was really critically important. So, or 2011, 2012. I mean, this went on until 2015. Really, when doctors were, the codes changed and doctors were able to diagnose chemical illnesses, okay? But this could have happened earlier. anyway, what happens now is harm, okay? These chemicals park in your body and you get harm. So what longitudinal studies in other countries of large marine coastal oil spills, I'm talking about the Prestige in Spain and the Have I Spirit in South Korea, they have already found a causal link between exposures and harm. And that's that three-step process on the right side there. Harm in oil spill workers and coastal residents. So what these scientists have tracked over now 10 years or more is that they found biomarkers in people first, and biomarkers indicate presence of a disease state in a body system. So then they were able to say, okay, what system is this biomarker flagging for us? Where's the flags to show us where the harm is being caused? And these researchers were able next to find the actual genotoxicity, literally the damage to DNA, RNA, chromosomes, the genetic damage to specific body organs. And over time, the chromosome breaks, the chromosome instabilities, this damage to genetic materials is the process that can lead to cancer formation. But in Spain and South Korea, they were actually able to trace this all the way to actual cancers and long-term diseases. So, for example, in both South Korea and Spain, these scientists traced the processes of oil spill exposure to diseases of the respiratory system, like cystic fibrosis, COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary dysfunction, and asthma. And they also traced it to diseases of the blood system, like acute myeloid leukemia, T-cell lymphoma, and acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Now, the long-term studies on workers and coastal residents from the BP disaster are also starting to find similar results. Okay, so with that in mind, that link between exposure and intake and harm, we're going to go now to Lesley Pacey with just a brief introduction. That we actually met the first year of the BP disaster when I was embedded in coastal communities. And at that time, she had already co-founded the Eastern Shore Community Health Partners. So Lesley, can you please tell us why? Thank you for joining the panel. And please share your story of how you came to start this nonprofit organization.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me. My daughter, Sarah, was diagnosed with leukemia in 2004. And at the time I was a newspaper reporter for the Mobile Register, and there was about 5 other kids within my immediate community that also had leukemia. So those parents had reached out to me and my antenna went up and I thought, this isn't normal. So went through all the traditional channels, contact public health agencies, state and federal, really didn't get a whole lot of help. There was some investigations that stopped and started, but I kind of quickly realized I was on my own with really trying to ferret out the true scope of how many rare cancers we have in the area in children and adults and what the environmental links might be. So I've kind of devoted a long time to trying to figure that out, make partnerships with universities, some of which we were successful in and some not so successful in getting those together. And then, as you had mentioned, I met you 2 years after I had started the nonprofit foundation in 2010, when you were here traveling around trying to warn everybody about the problems that we are now seeing. So I was covering you for not the newspaper, but for a magazine, and Sense magazine, and at that time we were all very concerned, but we just didn't know how concerned we really needed to be, because there was the vast body of BP and the government and everybody saying, hey, beaches are open, come on down. And it was summertime. So
before we get there, can we have the first slide of her set, please? Which is, please close the loop with your daughter. How is she today?
Oh, yeah, Sarah's doing great. She is 19 years old. She's a freshman in college. That's a picture of her on the lower right-hand side. She's a great kid. She's doing well and she's very healthy. She goes every year for checkups. And, she's done great. Yeah.
So the next slide shows where we just now got caught up to 2010. And here's your family swimming. So tell us about, weren't the health officials, they weren't really saying anything. I was there, but
yeah, and they kept telling us that Corexit was safe and that the oil, didn't get into Mobile Bay, which we now know is not true. There was some plumes that went into our bay where we live. We were smelling the petroleum smells in the air, but this had never happened to this community before. We didn't know what we were doing. And I kind of kept my kids out of the water. Those photos there were in August, and it was a birthday party, and it was my son's birthday, and we were out there. We would go boating from time to time. And as you can see in the background, there's the yellow boom and also a rig that's carrying all this stuff. Because what you don't see in the photographs is directly across from Point Clear is Theodore, Alabama. And most people don't know this unless they were heavily involved in it during the oil spill, but Theodore was one of the decontamination stations. So all of the boats were coming in to Mobile Bay, all oily and gross. They were supposed to be, hosed off before they went in, but they actually were going past us right into, the decontamination.
And the thing that people don't really think about is, okay, the boom on the water surface, what's that going to do? Right. Maybe on a day when there's no waves, stop some oil from getting over it, but the oil can go under it, and the oil is dissolved in the water itself. So there's like the whole water column under the surface is full of oil. Okay, right. So let's get into the story, because I believe you've told me that after the BP disaster, which would be the next slide, you started, the cancers just started ballooning. So
right. So I had been keeping this database of rare cancers, and I had been looking at all the way back to actually 95. I kind of just started really assessing what we had out there. But after the oil spill back in 2017, I kind of said, well, gee whiz, let me see how many of these have popped up since the oil spill. So I did a count, and as you can see here, we have 20 leukemias and this is just the ones that I know about, okay, through social media and through small town and people telling me things. This is certainly not comprehensive, but I counted the 20 leukemias, 14 brain and nervous system cancers, 2 reproductive cancers, 8 lymphomas, 26 sarcomas, and 16 digestive cancers. A lot of these are in children. And so
why don't we go to the next slide and because people have asked for, okay, but what exact kind of cancers? And so carry on with the story about children.
Yeah, sure. So we had a lot of leukemias in children, a lot of AMLs, which is acute myeloid leukemia, very difficult to treat. 9 of those, 10 ALLs, acute lymphoblastic, back in 2004. 1 chronic myeloid leukemia. We have 5 lymphomas, 1 rare Burkitt's lymphoma, 2 Hodgkin's, and then we've had rare diseases pop up as well: Lou Gehrig's disease, Menkes disease, which is a nervous system disease, as you can see, and 1 Hashimoto's. And obviously, since then, I've heard about many Hashimoto's. So there's been probably, I know, about 4 or 5 more Hashimoto's disease since then.
Hashimoto's is thyroid?
Yes.
Or, endocrine system and thyroid.
I think it's endocrine system and thyroid. I just know it's a really rare, the doctor might speak better to that, is specifically what it is. I just know it's a rare
thyroid disease.
Okay. Yeah, and so we're having a lot of autoimmune diseases as well that aren't reflected in this.
We can go to the next slide. I tried to break these whoops. Yeah, there we go.
Okay.
These cancers out by organ system. Trying to remember the process of how you'd get biomarkers to an organ system and then get a cancer. I mean, there's a process here. So,
Right.
but it's striking the number of children, I think. And
It is. And I mean, it gets to the point where every year I hear probably 5 new cases in just our county alone. We have a page on Facebook where we link families. And so we'll invite that family in. It's called Baldwin County Childhood Cancer Caregivers on Facebook. And we have invited those families in. And that page has grown and grown and grown. And it's full of photos of kids from the county that have rare cancers. So,
and I just want to point out that children, and these go from infants all the way up to 18 years old. I mean, these are teenagers, these are children, these are toddlers, these are infants.
yes, we have a lot of young adult cancers, especially in males, in our county as well. Yes.
And they're not all have survived this. These are statistics.
No. And, there was a documentary made back in 2016 that came out as a short film about our organization and what we were doing and what we were trying to figure out. And there was a little girl, a baby that was born with a germ cell tumor, and she's in the film, and she did pass away. So there's been a lot of kids that have died. And these brain cancers that we're having are particularly troubling. We have these DIPG brain cancers that we're seeing in Baldwin and Mobile County, as well as in Mississippi, and in the coastal areas of the panhandle of Florida, which of course are all oil spill impact zones. We're seeing what many people have described as a cluster of diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma cancers, which are 99.9% fatal.
So we're pretty much a death sentence.
Yes, they are. And so there's been a lot of concern about that. And is there an oil spill connection?
So the link to me with children in particular is that children are smaller. And if you think of their bodies as like a rain barrel, this is a teaching actually from Dr. Ray at the Environmental Health Center in Dallas. He taught me that. Think of your body as a rain barrel, and drip, 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 these toxic chemicals or whatever is in the air, is in the water, is in the food you eat, are collecting in your body as a rain barrel. Your body tries to get rid of them. But small children in particular, I mean, I saw families at the beach. Well, the parents are breathing the air, the kids are breathing the air, the kids are getting like an adult dose of these cancers, right? It's like an adult dose of cold medicine, for example. You would give a child cold medicine, not adult. And there's a reason for that, okay? So the reason is that these bodies can't handle these pharmaceutical drugs, these poisons at the same dose as adults, or really at all, because they're respiring faster, they're metabolizing faster.
And their DNA is replicating, isn't it? Much faster.
Right,
so that
much faster. And it's just, it's not good. So these kids are like the canaries in the coal mine, sort of. So why don't we take it to the next slide in your set? There was another breakout of different types of cancers.
Right.
Besides brain, we went to, digestive system. Think about it. You've been poisoned, okay? That's what this stuff is.
Right. Yeah, there's been a lot of digestive cancers, and it makes me wonder, how much of that is from consumption of, seafood that's not, up to snuff. There was just a report that came out today saying that they're finding hydrocarbons in all the fish. They tested 1,500 fish. I think it was the University of South Florida, and every single one of those fish in the Gulf had hydrocarbons in the liver of the fish. So, I mean, this is how many years later. The study went up through 2018. So what are we doing here? Are we eating stuff that's safe or not? So, and it makes you wonder how much of this is related to consumption of fish and right.
One thing to be wary of is that the officials, state and federal, can monkey with the formula that they use to determine whether food is safe, whether air is safe.
Yes.
That's sort of in quotes. They never really say safe, by the way. And what happened in the Gulf Coast area was, instead of allowing a 1 in a million cancer risk, the officials allowed 100 in a million cancer risk. So they bumped everybody up. They made it more risky to eat the seafood. But then they could still say it was okay to eat. People down there eat a lot of seafood. And one of the things I advised when I was down there, and it was really bad, 2010, 11, and 12 still, was what happens in Lake Michigan, where pregnant women, for example, are advised not to limit their intake of Lake Michigan fish because of the heavy metals in the fish. Well, in the Gulf Coast, it could be kind of the same sort of a thing, but limit your intake because it's still toxic. It's maybe still got a lot of chemicals in it. So I think there's one more slide after the digestive set. Another breakdown of different, bone and soft tissue, which is another problem. Yeah.
We've had a lot of sarcomas and, in children. I mean, the ones that we're looking at right now, these are all kids. These are all children. There's no adults in here.
Oh, I didn't realize that when I was looking at your database. Sorry for that. But
no. It's okay. No, it's rare in childhood, but these are all kids from best I can remember. And these rhabdomyosarcomas are also tend to be deadly for the most part. They're very hard to cure. This synovial sarcoma is like a 1 in a million cancer. We had 2 in 6 months.
In a population in Baldwin County of 200,000 approximately.
Yes. Yeah.
So
it's kind of weird that, we're having so many of these, and these kids are, very, very sick. And unfortunately, some of them don't make it through this,
which is horrible for the parents too. So the last slide of yours, your data set is what you call word of mouth. You are actually hearing from people. So what I asked you to do was actually look at the National Cancer Institute database, Baldwin County rankings. So could you please explain what this official data set is?
Yeah. Right here, we are just kind of pulling. I did a study, like I go into their website and I go through everything and I kind of configure it the best I can. And I pull out what the elevations are. So what I found for Baldwin County to be the main elevated cancers and areas of concern in the area from this time period that was available is childhood cancer is elevated. We're one of the top counties, like in terms of childhood cancer in the US, and childhood and adult leukemia is very elevated, especially if you just look at the male statistic of birth to age 49. It puts us in a very high, as you can see, percentage. We're like basically in the top like 9 or 10 for those counties. And there's 3,142 counties in the US. So, I mean, we do have a lot of leukemia, especially when it comes to males. So
let me add
what is going on?
Well, let me add that, just remind everybody that the BP disaster, Corexit dispersants were used in unprecedented amounts for an unprecedented duration of 2 months, although Lori's photos, docu photos show that actually that it's never stopped, dispersant spraying. So, and the solvents in the dispersants contain chemicals that lyse or break apart the blood cells and that cause blood disorders. And leukemia is a disorder of the blood. Okay. That's why I have worked basically since 2010 to start to show that there is actually a link and a causal link between these exposures to oil and chemicals during the BP disaster and the harm that we're seeing now, still to this day. And the studies now are coming out to support this. So let's go off slide just for a sec, because Julie Bradley was not able to join us today. And I just want to support her and her organization for a minute. So I went to her website and looked up Cancer's Costumes for a Cause. In a pre-interview, Julie had told me about losing her mother and her sister to aggressive cancers, which devastated the whole family, not just the people who passed. And Julie remembered her sister's main concern was, how could she afford to keep up with her bill payments and maintain some sorts of sense of normalcy with her kids while fighting for her life? And after that, Julie just decided to form with a bunch of friends Costumes for a Cause, with the thinking that no one should ever have to worry about how they're going to pay for their bills or put food on the table while fighting for their lives. What Cancers for a Cause does is they host fundraisers, usually multiple ones during a year, and 100% of the proceeds go to local families in need of financial assistance while fighting cancer. The organization serves families in 3 coastal communities of Mississippi: Jackson, Hancock, and Harrison, and also one bordering one, Stone County. So Julie has also noticed increases in cancers and people asking for assistance since the BP disaster. And I've asked Lesley to share some of her observations about the data set that Julie kindly shared with both of us. So we can go to that slide now.
Sure.
Mississippi slide.
I think it's assistance cancers.
Yep, and I'm calling them assistance cancers. Again, it's a word of mouth database like yours, Lesley. And these are specifically people who have asked for assistance.
Yes, some kind of financial assistance. Okay, it really actually, just glancing at her numbers, and of course this is not complete, this is just what she knows about, but the glioblastomas, they're up. That looks like a lot of brain cancer. Leukemias, 38 blood system cancers, that's a lot of leukemia. We have lung cancers, thyroid cancers, nodular melanomas, and that's of skin cancers, and breast cancers and ovarian cervical cancers of the reproductive system. So they seem to be really very busy over there with Mississippi and the cancers they're seeing. And I have a good friend that works with Julie Bradley, and she is on the board, and she tells me all the time about, some of the backstory, without mentioning names, but she tells me a lot of these people actually, had some kind of oil spill connection. They either lived along the coast, they had a family member that worked the oil spill, they went to a school that was right along the coastline, and then the kids got sick, and then there was 4 or 5 kids in the same school in Mississippi that came down with cancer that same year. So there is a lot of, of course it's anecdotal information, but there is a lot of information out there that is concerning when you hear the people that are on the ground living in the communities and their observations. You just don't want to discount it. You want to definitely take it into consideration.
And Costumes for a Cause, Julie's group, does not only, you really don't either. You don't know if the cancers that you're seeing are definitely caused by the BP disaster or not. But in Julie's case, they decided to also take hardship cases with skin cancers and
Right.
And more of the reproductive cancers, which so these databases, the one that you have worked on and this one are slightly different, but they're both word of mouth. And the leukemia is what really struck me. In your anecdotal evidence, are you hearing a lot of, you did mention some children, but is it, and you specifically focused on children and rare cancers, but
Right.
You are hearing a lot of the Mississippi ones are children as well, it seems.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That have, either had some kind of activity on the water or lived on the water or had a family member that did beach cleanup or in the VU program, the Vessels of Opportunity program. And, and like I said, we can't specifically point to that and go, wow, that's caused by the oil spill. But we are seeing a lot of these blood cancers, and it makes you wonder.
So the next slide, another overlap with your data are the digestive cancers, and that, again, poisoning, it was huge. And so I thought to break it all down. So
yeah, so let's see, we have esophageal, liver, pancreatic, renal cell, which is kidney, intestinal, stomach, colon, and rectal. And so, yeah, I mean, it kind of mirrors what we're seeing here in Alabama, in the coastal areas. And these are areas that I don't know about Stone County because that's a little bit north, but all these other counties that she's working, the other 3 counties in Mississippi, Jackson, Harrison, and what was the other one? They're all right on the water.
Hancock.
Hancock.
Lori Bosarge just texted a chat to say that she is following our show live. And this is actually one of the reasons we are doing this show, is because people still to this day have not connected the dots between their sort of slow decline in health function, body function, and health with the oil spill disaster. And Lori Bosarge wrote, a cancer survivor, now 3 years old, had Ewing sarcoma in his jawbone. He had to they had to remove the lower jaw and replace it with 2 of his ribs. I had never connected this with the oil disaster until I saw that chart. And that is specifically why we are taking the time to do these live streams, is to help people connect the dots.
Yeah.
So and I think that's one of your strong wrap-up points. We can just
Yes.
skip to that, is what you
Well,
had.
the people, no, people aren't connecting the dots. It's a real shame because, we've all were exposed, whether we worked the oil spill or lived right on the beach or not. We were all exposed in this area to oil and Corexit. Okay. And there's been a lot of sickness. There's been a lot of cancers. There's been a lot of neurological problems. So people are not connecting those dots. It's almost like we were all brainwashed into believing that everything was okay and it was all in our heads and there must be something wrong with us. When in fact, that's not the case at all.
I totally skipped 2 really important parts of the story, which are,
I'm not getting into too much.
Yeah, well, I thought we'd mention the film, The Cost of Silence, and your role in that, because this Cost of Silence was filmed in secret for 9.5 years. And it is a very telling expose of investigative journalism following the evolution and emergence of this ongoing human health tragedy that really was preventable to this much of a scale. And this film screened at the Sundance Film Festival in January of this year. We ran into each other again there. We were part of that. It will be coming out. It's called the website is costofsilencefilm.com. But maybe you could briefly share your role in some of that.
Yeah, how I got involved in the film was back in, I want to say, pretty early on. It was about 2015, 2016. I started counting up my cancers, and we had a mutual friend, who's Tricia Springstead, who's in the film as well. And she had connected us, and I kept emailing Mark, and I kept saying, Mark, we got to talk about these cancers. I mean, I think there's a link. And I think it was prior to when he was really delving into the cancer aspect. It was kind of early because the latency period for cancer is around 8 to 15 years for most cancers, not for your blood cancers. Those happen a lot faster. But anyway, so he wasn't really delving into that deeply at that point. And I kept saying, you got to come to Fairhope. You got to come over here to Baldwin County. And I think I must have corresponded with him for about a year. And then finally, he came down and we did an interview. So I'm briefly in the film talking about the childhood cancers that I've been seeing. But, after that, I just, kept in communication with him. I helped set up some interviews for him with some of the victims. And I participated in those interviews and did a lot of research for the film. So I ended up in sort of an associate producer role in the film. And I'm very proud of Mark Manning and everything that whole entire crew has done, including you.
And Mark told me that he never expected to be filming for 9.5 years.
Yeah.
He told me that. Well, he said during one of the post-film Q&A that they had wrapped the film 6 times over probably 7 or 8 years. They said, this film is a wrap, it's done. And then there'd be something more, and it finally did get done. It will be coming out, and Alert Project will be posting when that is finally out. costofsilencefilm.com. And finally, let's just do a little brief thing on the BP class action medical benefits settlement had a sort of a footnote to it. And that footnote is called the back end litigation for chronic illnesses. And you are involved in that right now. So just explain what you're seeing with what that is and what you're seeing with that.
Okay. My background's in journalism, but and also in public health with what's been going on with the cancer clusters. And I had an opportunity through my friend Trisha again to start working with a law firm that was one of the few law firms that's actually handling the back end litigation part of the oil spill claims. And it was funny, and I kind of want to tell you this little story because I was like, I don't know, I never worked, in law before, and I don't know what to think of this. And I kept running into a friend of mine in Fairhope who was sick, and I hadn't seen her in years. And she said she was dying of a blood cancer. And I said, perchance, does it have anything to do with BP? And she said, yeah, as a matter of fact, it does. And it blew me away. And I thought, you got to be kidding me. She's one of my neighbors anyway. So turns out that kind of was like my sign that, okay, this is a real deal. I need to do this. I need to help people. So I got into doing this in 2017. I'm a BP client coordinator, which means I work with people with chronic illnesses related to exposure. So what were your questions about that?
Well, you're just seeing more of the same types of cancers and a lot of them as in your role of coordinator, and not just from Baldwin County.
Yes, I'm seeing, I work from everywhere from New Orleans or through the Louisiana area through the Pensacola area, all along the Gulf Coast. We're seeing cancers and we're seeing a lot of neurological problems. It is extremely common to have people that are neurologically damaged that are suffering pretty heavily day in and day out with a multitude of health problems. And they are not, sadly enough, like you said before, linking it to their exposure until they, talk to somebody else or get into contact with us. And then they start realizing, oh yeah, I was heavily exposed. Oh, is that linked to it? You know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of, there's problem with people, not connecting the dots, and then also not knowing they have any kind of rights.
And so thank you very much, Lesley, for all your time. And we're running a little over time. So I'm hoping Dr. Carter can stick with us here. But I think one of the wrap-ups for me from Lesley's talk is if you suddenly do start to connect the dots here, you don't have to go and get involved in this lawsuit. You can. That is an option, this back litigation. But the other thing is certainly to go and find an environmental medicine doctor, okay, who can help you detox and might be able to help with more. So Dr. McCarter, finally, we're to you. And thank you for joining us. As I explained at the beginning, my connection with this clinic stems from the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And I have asked you to share some of the case studies, a little bit about what environmental medicine is, because maybe people don't know. And then we'll get into some case studies. So
sure.
Welcome.
So environmental medicine, thank you for having me. Thank you for the work you're doing, and you're making the awareness, because you're right, people do not make the connection to an exposure, and then, we'll talk about, more exposures occur, and then the person. So environmental medicine is basically that. We're looking at exposures in the air, in the food, in the water, what's going on in an environment, the working environment, the home environment. And we're looking at that for cause of disease, because I'm internal medicine trained and board certified, but we don't really learn to use that. We basically learn that if there's a disease or symptom, we're going to diagnose and we're going to give, treatment with medications. And so this is a field where we're looking at why is this happening. And, we talk about genetics, and genetics are important, but the other thing about environmental medicine is we're looking at all of it. So your environment can trigger different genes to be turned off and on, what you're eating. There's all these interconnections that are going on, the level of exposure, what's going on in the home environment. So that's how I got into this, because I was starting to see actually cancers in younger people, and I was wondering, why is this happening? So that's kind of where I got started with Dr. Ray, who was just, amazing father of ecology that's done all this work on environmental medicine.
Nice. Thank you for that. And I had the privilege of meeting him before he passed in 2018 and working with him.
Yes.
And I'm still using and sharing his teachings.
Right.
So I know, because I was in the Gulf Coast communities for a good part of 7 years following the BP disaster, that people found their way to your clinic, like the Exxon Valdez workers found their way to your clinic. So I asked if you could share maybe some just case histories of what you're seeing and how you're treating people, like what's done now, 21st century.
Yeah, so 21st century, we look at, the home environment, we look at the working environment and the level of exposure. So we can do tests to look at toxics, and how much is in the blood. We were doing some blood, or actually breath analysis, and Dr. A was doing that quite a bit. And so we can look at, what's going on in the brain. As you said, several things happen with the body. Multiple systems are affected. People initially have, these different symptoms of initially a blurry vision or shortness of breath or headaches, but then it progresses to other systems, like the abdominal pain, reflux, and then it progresses to more neurological things. So that's really important to look at. So we evaluate all of those systems. We do what's called a venous blood gas. So a venous blood gas actually helps look at oxygen coming back to from the body, from the tissues, and it actually helps us determine, is there inflammation in the body that there's small blood vessels that are not extracting oxygen. And many people, like you were mentioning earlier, they go around and they don't realize they feel as bad as they do. And then when we find these issues and we actually start giving them oxygen, they're, oh my gosh, I had no idea that my brain was so foggy, or I felt so bad, because people get tired, they get fatigue and muscle weakness, and it just becomes chronic, and they don't really understand that they're, feeling so bad at some point. It's like, so very important to evaluate all of those things. We look at nutrients, we look at how's the body's, nutrient, we look at microbiome, which has become a big factor now in environmental medicine as well, because your bacteria that live in your gut actually have 9 million genes, and it's part of how we biotransform these toxins that get into our body. And so, what we're looking at is, why is the body can only adapt so long. It depends on the level of exposure, but if you're getting hit with something and then you have a huge exposure, you can't compensate for other things that then come along that are usually not a big problem, because once that adaptation mechanism and the body's ability to handle these different chemicals in the organ systems are overloaded, Dr. A always uses what's called a barrel. So the barrel gets overloaded. And once that's overloaded, every little thing is going to trigger people. So we try to help them bring that down.
Okay, so let me take a breath. That was great. And I just want to stress one thing that you said really triggered me, because people have mentioned this in the previous episodes as well. They're getting older. They thought they were just forgetting. And Captain Lori in episode 2 talked about a different kind of forgetting that she tried to communicate to her doctor. It's a different kind of forgetting. And indeed it is. It's called lack of oxygen to your brain, is
Right.
what it's called.
Right.
So why don't we go into your case studies with the first slide?
Sure.
And then,
So this was a boat captain that was involved in the BP spill response for cleanup. So he was involved from May to June, and he was exposed to the Corexit as well. And he had very similar, I don't have pictures handy, but he had very similar exposure and pictures that looked like Lori's legs. And he got that pretty quickly. He also noticed he had migraines and dizziness. He was treated, he had tremendous eye pain, nosebleeds, and a lot of people report brain fog, so they can't think. It's like you said, it's not so much trouble with memory, but they just can't think. And so he progressed to some chest pain and severe abdominal pain, difficulty digesting. I didn't put it on here, but he lost a lot of weight. He said his feet felt like he was on fire, even after the exposure, and he felt like he had acid on his skin. He was hospitalized, and he was treated in a vascular wound unit for several months. But he continued to progress in symptoms, and this is long after his exposure ended. So he had shortness of breath. He started having more lung issues, sleep apnea. He also, during this time, developed kidney stones. So his renal system was, things were not working correctly in that area. And of course, the common thing we see is people start to get this progressive fatigue and muscle weakness and fibromyalgia. They're constantly have these trigger points that they're constantly hurting with no other inflammatory causes that are found.
So, yeah. Okay. So when you get a person like this, what's your, and I think we can go to the next slide, some of the tests that you mentioned that you do. And I do want to connect the dots to people with this conception that their fatigue and their muscle weakness is maybe oxygen related, which is part of, yeah. So everything's connected, and that's the magic to me of environmental medicine, is they're looking at the whole you rather than just this little part of you that might be connected to this bigger part where actually the problem is, right? So, okay, so this is your slide.
I just wanted to show this slide just because we had a lot of patients that came from Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, that were exposed to Corexit, and and Dr. Ray really emphasized the fact that the 2-butoxyethanol is extremely toxic. It does lead to cancer, does affect the blood system and the liver and the kidneys. And they all had these very similar symptoms, even young people. And we ended up finding that they all had very high levels of solvents in their blood. So cough, rashes, feeling their lungs are tight all the time. And this is after exposure. They're away from the acute exposure, but lots of infections in the throat and sinuses. But yeah, so what we do with patients like this is we can, first of all, we evaluate their immune system, because their immune system will be low in function, and a lot of doctors don't do that. Yeah, a lot of doctors don't do that. They don't look at what's going on with the immune system. We do a blood volatile solvent panel, so we can see how many solvents are in their blood. And as you can see, this gentleman had quite a few, which you don't see this in people who are not exposed to an oil or some kind of chemical. So
and this test was 2 years after his
yes.
exposure?
Yes.
After his exposure.
Right. So what I wanted to mention is sometimes when that barrel is really full, the person can't get rid of these toxins either, because their detox mechanisms, their organs, their liver, their kidneys are not functioning at an optimal level, so they can kind of like storing it. And so he started doing treatment, and sometimes these levels actually go higher, and then they start to come down. But it's a process, because these chemicals love to store in the fat, and that's the other problem, is that it just gets stored there, and then the person's not able to get rid of them. So you can see he had really high benzene, ethylbenzene, styrene, toluene, xylene. So yeah, he was extremely impaired.
Yeah. Next slide, I think. We have a series on him.
Yes, this is another thing we can do. We actually do what's called a brain SPECT scan. This is the only place that you can do this. We do a triple camera that Dr. Ray and Dr. Simon developed. And what it is, they use function. So when you have a PET scan or a quantitative MRI, you're just looking at structure. And then a PET scan, you're looking at function, but you're just looking at glucose or oxime. It's not really looking at are the brain cells working. And so glutathione is what we use to label, because the brain cells use glutathione. And so when we see these, like if you look on the person, if you're looking at the shiny, nice, smooth part on the one side, on the left side, that's a normal brain. And on the right side, you see what's happening with these patients that get exposure. So they have a very, we call it a salt and pepper look. And that's all these holes where their glutathione is not being uptaked by the brain. And then there's a soft tissue shunting of the blood flow, so that's not going to all parts of the brain. So it's a flow and function test, and it only can be designated as toxicity. So it's not something that's psychiatric. I mean, this is a real toxic test. And so if you look at the bottom right, there's a lot of, you see on the left side, a lot of yellow, and it's very bright. That's good flow. And if you look at the person, the bottom Right, he has none of that, and that's because the temporal lobes tend to get very affected. That's your memory center, so you get a lot of decreased blood flow in these patients that have had these exposures. And this is actually a reversible test, but we've had patients, where we've actually had them go get a regular scan because we want to see is there something like a brain tumor. But this is kind of like what you're going to see in someone that's, having a lot of these symptoms and can progress very easily to a tumor.
Did you say it was reversible or irreversible?
It is reversible.
It
We have
is.
had patients, yes, with our treatment to get better.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Carry on. Next slide.
So we did a breath analysis on this gentleman, and he had now remember, this is 2 years later, he still had extremely high levels of solvents. You can see all of them there: butadiene, benzene, pentane, hexane, propane, butane, butanone. And then we do what's called provocation neutralization testing. So we can actually, it's not like a typical allergy test. We skin test the different frequencies of these types of things. Like, you can do foods and pollen and molds, but the body's basically, it's like looking at electrical almost system, because when you go into this dermal layer of the skin and we take an imprint of what this substance looks like and introduce it to the body, you'll see a reaction. And then actually, when we go to the dermal level, we are actually affecting what's called dendritic cells. So that connects to your nervous system. So unlike a regular allergy test, we can actually provoke symptoms if the person has had a sensitization to these components, and we can actually use the dilution method to find a spot where their body can actually see that substance where it stops having a big wheel or response, and their symptoms actually turn off. So we're affecting not just the immune system like an allergy test, but we're actually helping the nervous system balance out. And it was very interesting with this gentleman because the hexane and the toluene and benzene all reproduced flushing of his skin and the blurry vision. And we do all these tests in a very controlled environment, because that was one of the things Dr. Ray discovered, is that you environmentally control your environment. So it's very low in any toxins, or pesticides or mold. We can actually reproduce symptoms and know that it's triggered by that particular substance.
Wow. Next slide. It's come a long way since 30 years.
And so then we look at immune tests. So a lot of patients, there's two main wings to your immune system. You have the IgG immunoglobulins, and then you have what's called T and B cells. And when those, we think of it like an airplane. And so if those, one wing is the IgG, one wing is the T and Bs. If those wings are down, the plane's not going to fly, and it's not going to do well. And that's what happens is people get immune dysfunction. And as an internist, I can tell you, I've not really been trained to look at that. We just look at a basic blood test and say, oh, your white blood cell count is okay. But this is very important, because what we can do is we also treat these deficiencies. Immunoglobulins can be treated. You can have oral and injectable, because what happens is their immune system got so inflamed and weakened that these things become deregulated. And I think that's a lot to do with the cancers and autoimmune diseases. You get this early deregulation of these different parts of the immune system. So T cells were very low in this man. We do another functional test, but I didn't show the slide, but we can actually do almost like a TB skin test, and it will show you the different things that you should show a T cell response to that you're exposed to pretty much on a common basis. And if that doesn't show any function, or doesn't reproduce any bumps, then we know that the T cells are not working. They're like the soldiers, they're just not fighting. So we can actually help patients grow an immune booster made from their own blood that will help that. So that's some of our treatment as well. And then we look at the autonomic nervous system, because what happens when people get exposed is their autonomic nervous system becomes heightened in reactivity to other things. So you get this heightened sympathetic. I tell people it's like the gas on the car is on all the time and the brakes are off. And the brakes are your rest and digest, the parasympathetic. That's a part of your body that helps you sweat and detox. So that's completely abnormal in this man. You see he's got increased sympathetics and decreased parasympathetics. So part of our treatment is to balance that.
So all these digestive system cancers that we've been seeing, for example, they could be linked to an autonomic nervous system malfunction.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
And the other big thing about that is your GI tract is your interface with the environment. Everything about your colon is, Hippocrates actually taught this, but I don't think we really, nobody learns this in medical school, but Hippocrates said the disease starts in the colon, because that's where all your bacteria live. That's the microbiome. It weighs a couple pounds. It's just like an organ, like the liver. And that gets very, very affected by exposures. So that's your interface with the environment. It's very important to heal that as well.
I think next.
So this is another patient that was from BP oil spill. He was a commercial scuba diver, and he was exposed for some time, June through December. He did notice that he was, in oil as he was diving, and he got short of breath a lot, coughs, headaches, same things as the other man. And then he progressed very quickly to fatigue and joint pain, eye pain, skin infections. Eventually, he started having seizures. And he became, unfortunately, wheelchair bound. So that when we saw him, he was wheelchair bound at that point.
Oh, man. Next, a 34-year-old wheelchair bound.
Yeah, so he had the same things. He had the SPECT scan that we saw earlier. He had the same patterns, salt and pepper, a decrease of uptake of blood flow to the brain, function was off, his temporal lobes were asymmetrical. He had very high levels of toluene, benzene, and hexane in his blood. And then he reproduced a lot of the symptoms with testing those by the skin testing method. He had joint pain reproduced, headache, muscle pain, eye pain, his brain fog. And so he started we do start them on some of the antigens to help try to, help their balance system out. So also he had high venous blood gas, and we ended up giving these patients oxygen.
Slide.
So this is his breath analysis. Again, extremely high levels of the different solvents and their metabolites. And then what we do also, Riki, is we give them oxygen by what's called Dr. von Arndein's method. Dr. von Arndein was a very intelligent German researcher during World War II. And he figured out that if the oxygen level, like we talked about earlier, is high coming back to the heart, that the small blood vessels and the tissues are very inflamed. And so what he figured is that these little lining cells that line your blood vessels are swollen, and the little pumps in there are not working. So when we give oxygen, we can do that for a couple hours a day, several days in a row, and that creates what's called a switch effect, and will help oxygen get to those tissues, because you really can't get that barrel to unload, and you can't get the detox unless you get the oxygen to these areas. And so once we do that, the patients immediately start to feel better and start to detox.
And I think, go to the next slide if it's one more. Nope, not yet. So are you seeing these two cases? Do they come back? Do you have any reports of, are they getting better? I mean, post-treatment, what's happened?
Yeah, so post-treatment, a lot of these people can't afford the treatment, unfortunately, because insurance doesn't pay for some of this. And so we have not seen them back. I know that the captain did fairly well, because we do a home teaching that we help patients learn. And that is, when you get sick from some kind of exposure like this, you really have to clean up your home environment. Because if you think about a house.
Why don't we go off screen for a minute, and then you can show your, because I think this is an important part, and this is what Dr. Ray was doing 31 years ago. He was educating people about how to detox your own life, to take some ownership of it.
Exactly.
And so go ahead.
Yeah, he would say 75% of this is your home environment, because it becomes your sanctuary. It becomes the area where your body, especially your bedroom when you sleep, that's when your brain actually shrinks in size, and the lymph system of your brain is trying to clear toxins. So your bedroom is extremely important to keep very, very free of VOCs, because VOCs and hydrocarbons and all these things you're exposed to, like these gentlemen, they're in our house. And these people don't realize this, but 75% of this is your home environment. So if you think about formaldehyde and new furniture, personal care products, fragrance, plug-ins, appliances, if your car is parked inside a garage, it's right, your bedroom's right above that. All of these things people don't think about, and it's extremely important, because the number one and number two things we see is pesticides, natural gas, because people become very sensitized to these things, and they're toxic. And if your house is really, really sealed, you're going to be absorbing a lot of that. So your house is key. And then sauna, natural sweating, using a sauna or just even natural sweating helps take the load off that liver and helps your body start to excrete these toxins through the skin. And we teach patients how to do different nutrients so that they can, alkalinize and use these supplements to help increase those detox pathways in the liver, because that's super important. Water, people think, oh, I'm going to drink, bottled water. Well, bottled water, there's no safe plastic bottled water. And so we really teach patients about glass bottled water, and also the water in your home, on your shower and your sinks. You really need to do double filtration. We have actually filtered Dallas water 3 times and found tons of chemicals. And actually, I was at a conference not too long ago, and there's a gentleman in Arizona who's doing wastewater treatment water. He's analyzing it, and the triclosan and those sanitizers, they're really toxic to the endocrine system, and they don't break down. So all of these things are important, for patients to learn. And when they get their home environment really clean, they actually start to get better.
So I want to add 2 comments here. One is that on this water business, because I stayed with people in their homes, and when I was in the Gulf between 2010 and 2017.
Uh-huh.
And people drink bottled water, and all of my home hosts I gifted a Brita filter to, because in the long run it would save them money from having to buy
Right.
bottled water all the time.
Right.
And two, it was healthier than
Yes.
drinking bottled water. And I think the follow-up from that is even putting a water filtration system in, so you can get around the Britas. There's a little bit of upfront cost, but if over time it would
Oh, absolutely.
it would pay for itself. So
Just having those water filters on the shower heads, because when you shower, you absorb a ton of water through your skin. Yeah.
yep.
Very important.
So the other thing
I
is,
was gonna say, they have an RO system. What we recommend is get a carbon filter on the, past that part of it, and that will help immensely.
are there spots on your website where they can learn about some of these, what do you call them? You call them avoidance behaviors, but ways to detox your home and yourself.
Yeah, and we have a Facebook page that we post things as well. There's interviews and things we talk about. It's the Environmental Health Center of Dallas Facebook page.
Environmental Health Center Dallas.
Yeah, and the website is ehcd.com.
Yep, ehcd.com. I was also going to mention about those bedroom exposures. One of the unique things during the BP disaster I learned from people who were taking air quality samples they were from Boston, and they had been paid to take air quality samples, not by BP, but they discovered basically that the whole Gulf coastal surface is so hot down there, it evaporates up into the air during the day. So all the pollutants in it and everything else, and then all that blows ashore with the coastal, the breezes and stuff. And at night, there's an air inversion that sets up, and it's cold comes down. So as the cold comes down, it's literally like an accordion traps this layer of toxic pollutants right where at two-story homes, at those homes up on stilts. So people were exposed. I mean, I'm talking Gulf Coast residents were exposed 24/7 to this stuff. It was a really bad scene. And the final thing is to say about this part of this is that Dr. Ray, 75% of exposures may come from your home, but maybe not during an oil chemical disaster that goes on for 5 months. I mean, because it's outside, it's inside, it's everywhere.
He would always say, we recommend air filters, especially in the bedroom, and not the ionizing ones, but just the regular, air filters. But 50% of indoor air is outdoor air. It's common. And so I was going to mention too, just talking about all these cancers in children, and we had talked a little bit about this, is that the other big factor we're getting is 5G and its electromagnetics, because electromagnetic frequency and wireless radiation is not been properly studied. There's actually over 240 scientists have had an appeal because the basic safety standards are from 1996, and children are very vulnerable to this. So if you've got already an exposure to chemical or some other thing, and then you add this on top of it, we're very worried about what's going to happen, because it affects what's called the calcium channels in your cells. And so there's a whole upregulation, I think, that's going to happen. And they were talking about, doctors in Israel and Germany were talking about how much these very shortwave frequencies affect the skin. And so we're really concerned. And if any of your viewers want to get involved with this, I think it's important to educate people about it. And you can go to www.5gcrisis.com and also www.ehtrust.org. Because those are very helpful websites, because we need people to know that this is based basically right now on thermal effects, and there's so many peer-reviewed published studies that show non-thermal effects. And children, their nervous systems are developing right now, their stem cells are developing, they have a higher what we call dielectric constant of their brain, so they're more fluid, and so they're going to absorb more of this radiation, and we're already seeing that in studies. And so it's very important, and animals too.
So to wrap this up, I think is what we're going to do, because we're running a little bit over, and I'm conscious that you may have some patients to go to. So I just would like to say for your segment, Dr. McCarter, you have to buy soap, you have to buy shampoo, you have to buy dishwashing soap and laundry detergents, and the clothes that you buy and the cosmetics that you buy. You can buy different ones that have less of the harsh chemicals in them.
Yes, Environmental Working Group is a great site, ewg.org. They actually give you letter grades on what's best, because you're right. I mean, what you use on your body parabens, for example, they're in a lot of soaps and a lot of lotions. And I always tell patients, if you can't eat it, don't put it on your skin. You know, these are things that affect your endocrine system, your brain.
Suntan lotions even.
Oh, yeah.
Look at what you're putting on your skin. You're going to buy this stuff anyway, so it's not an added burden. It's just being more conscious of what you buy and turning your Wi-Fi off when
Yes.
you're not using it.
Yes.
I mean, really off, all the way
Yeah.
off.
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
So, okay. I am just very thankful for both of you, for Dr. McCarter and Lesley Pacey, for joining me in this call today, this panel, episode 3. I'd like to wrap up by saying, emphasizing that a lot of these long-term illnesses, diseases, cancers that people are suffering from in the wake of oil disasters are preventable. You can actually minimize your harm and prevent some of these things, but it has to be teamwork. The community has to be involved. The doctors need to be involved. The people need to be properly informed. And that's not what's been happening. And
Right.
that is one thing that Alert Project is
Great.
trying to change. I mean, we are going to change this. It's not only the National Contingency Plan. This is happening in all of our communities. So this is why we are launching the What's the Plan EPA campaign. We have already launched it. It's to better prepare and protect our citizens, communities, and tribes, as I mentioned before. And to make this happen, allies like you are really critical. It's about sharing and networking our information on Facebook, on social media, inviting your friends to our last live stream next Tuesday, April 21st. We'll be talking about actual local actions that people can do right in their own backyards to make things safer. Allies like you are also critical to, I'm a volunteer. Leslie's a volunteer on the partner organization. Julie's a volunteer. You know, step up in your own backyard, get trained in bucket brigade, get trained in some of these methods for air quality. We're going to be talking about this on the 21st. So allies like you are also critical to our donor-based organization. And so we're running a fundraising campaign as part of our campaign. And please go to our website and can look at our information, consider donating. Definitely this recording will be posted soon. You can share this. So once again, thank you panelists for joining us.
For having me.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you very much. And this concludes episode 3.